It was an unassuming brick building on the edge of town, its weathered facade giving no hint of the profound reputation it carried. The Margrove School of Fine Arts had been described as both a sanctuary for ambitious painters and a place shrouded in mystery. For decades, it had been under the guidance of its enigmatic head instructor, Mr. Tobias Acker, a man whose genius was as celebrated as it was whispered about in tones of unease. Students who attended his classes either emerged with works that defined their careers or left in silence, their brushes abandoned forever. This semester, a new cohort of students stood at the entrance, their breath fogging the cold autumn air. Among them was Ellie, a quiet young woman whose talent for painting had always come second to her fear of failure. She held her portfolio tightly, its edges frayed from constant handling. Next to her was Ben, a brash and confident painter whose ambition seemed to rise above everyone else's, and Rachel, a reserved but fiercely observant student who rarely spoke, but whose sketches often captured more than the eye could see. The heavy oak doors creaked open, revealing a spacious, yet dimly lit gallery filled with paintings that seemed to gaze at the students as they entered. Mr. Acker stood at the far end, his gaunt figure silhouetted against the light of a single tall window. His face, pale and angular, was as expressionless as the blank canvases that lined the walls. He greeted them without pleasantries. "Art is not about beauty," he began, his voice a rasp that echoed off the gallery walls. "It is about truth, and truth, as you will learn, is rarely kind." The first day passed in relative normalcy, though the air in the studio felt heavy, almost oppressive. Mr. Acker's instructions were unorthodox. He insisted the students paint with their hands, claiming brushes disconnected the artist from the raw emotion of their work. His critiques were brutal, sparing no one. Ellie, who had always sought validation in her art, felt her confidence crumble under his cold gaze. "You're afraid of what's inside you," he said, studying her work. "That fear shows in every stroke." Despite his harshness, there was an undeniable pull to his presence. The students worked late into the night, driven by a strange mixture of inspiration and dread. It was during these late hours that they began to notice oddities. The school shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, pooling in corners where no light should have reached. Sometimes, faint whispers could be heard, too faint to discern, but loud enough to unsettle. Rachel, ever perceptive, remarked that some of the paintings on the walls seemed to change, their details shifting imperceptibly from one hour to the next. By the end of the week, Ellie found herself drawn to a peculiar corner of the studio where an old, dusty canvas stood apart from the others. Its surface was blank, but its frame was intricately carved with symbols that felt ancient and unknowable. Mr. Acker caught her staring and placed a hand on her shoulder. His touch was ice-cold. "Some canvases," he said, his voice low, "wait for the right artist. Be careful what you awaken." The other students began to share stories of strange dreams, all eerily similar. In each, they stood before an endless gallery of paintings, each more grotesque than the last. In these dreams, they felt watched, as though something inside the paintings was alive. Ben laughed it off, calling it rookie nerves, but his bravado seemed forced. Even he had stopped staying late, something Rachel noticed immediately. On the second Friday, Mr. Acker announced that they would begin their first major project. Each student was to paint their deepest fear, an assignment that brought groans from the group but left Ellie feeling an inexplicable chill. That night, as she sat alone in the studio, the whispers seemed louder, almost deliberate. She could swear they were calling her name. When she finally left, her heart pounding in her chest, Ellie turned back for one last glance at the studio. Through the dim light, she saw the blank canvas in the corner. It wasn't blank anymore. A faint outline had appeared, as though someone had begun to sketch on it in the brief moments she had turned away. It was the outline of a face. Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that the canvas in the corner had been waiting for her. When she returned to the studio the next morning, the outline of the face was gone, replaced once again by an expanse of blankness. She convinced herself it had been her imagination, a trick of the light or a side effect of the stress that Mr. Acker's classes brought. But as she set up her station, A nagging unease clung to her like a shadow. The other students filtered in gradually, their footsteps echoing on the wooden floors. Rachel was the last to arrive, her face pale and eyes bloodshot. Couldn't sleep, she muttered when Ellie asked if she was all right. Rachel's gaze lingered on the walls of the studio. "Do you hear them?" she whispered. Ellie froze. "Hear what?" "The whispers," Rachel replied, her voice barely audible. "Late at night, when it's quiet. It's like the walls are alive." Ellie wanted to dismiss it as a figment of Rachel's tired mind, but she couldn't ignore the memory of the whispers she herself had heard. She nodded slowly, her agreement unspoken but understood. Rachel's relief was palpable, as if she'd feared she was losing her mind. Mr. Acker's arrival broke their conversation. He strode into the room, his presence commanding silence without effort. "Your fear paintings are due by week's end," he announced, his tone clipped. "Remember, art without truth is merely decoration. And decoration has no place here." As the students worked, the atmosphere grew heavier. Ellie couldn't explain it, but the very air seemed to hum with a low, almost imperceptible vibration. The studio was always cold, but today the chill seemed to seep into her bones. She glanced around and noticed Rachel staring at the far wall, her brush suspended in midair. "What's wrong?" Ellie whispered. Rachel didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was tight. "That painting, it wasn't like that yesterday." She pointed to a landscape hanging near the corner. It depicted a serene meadow, but now the colors were muted, the scene overcast. And in the background, almost too faint to see, was the outline of a figure standing among the trees. Ellie swallowed hard. "Are you sure?" Rachel nodded. "I remember because I liked it. It was peaceful." But now, her voice trailed off, and she shook her head. "Never mind. It's probably nothing." By evening, most of the students had left, but Ellie stayed behind to finish her sketch. The studio was eerily quiet, the faint hum of the heating system the only sound. She focused on her work, her pencil moving in rhythmic strokes. When she felt it again, the whispers. At first, they were faint, indistinguishable from the sound of the wind outside. But as the minutes passed, they grew louder, more distinct. They didn't seem to come from one direction, but from all around her, as though the very walls of the studio were speaking. She froze, her pencil suspended midair. "Ellie," her name. It was unmistakable. The voice was soft, almost gentle, but it sent a jolt of fear through her. She spun around, expecting to see someone standing behind her, but the room was empty. She was alone. The blank canvas in the corner caught her eye, its surface still pristine. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her from its direction. Fighting the urge to run, she gathered her things and left the studio in a hurry, her footsteps echoing loudly in the empty hallway. That night, she dreamed of the canvas. In her dream, the face she had seen before was back, but it was no longer just an outline. It was fully formed, staring at her with eyes that seemed to pierce her soul. "Help me," it whispered, its lips moving in a silent plea. Ellie woke up drenched in sweat, her heart pounding. For a long time, she sat in the dark, her mind racing. She didn't know what was happening in that studio, but one thing was clear: she wasn't imagining it. And whatever was happening, it was far from over. Ellie's exhaustion clung to her the next morning as she made her way to the Margrove School of Fine Arts. The dream of the canvas had been so vivid, its intensity lingering like a bruise on her consciousness. She hadn't dared to tell anyone, not even Rachel, for fear of sounding unhinged. But as she stepped into the studio, she felt it immediately. The tension in the air, thick and heavy like storm clouds gathering overhead. The other students were subdued, their usual chatter replaced by a silence that was almost reverent. Ellie noticed Ben sitting at his easel, staring at his half-finished painting with a furrowed brow. His confidence, once so brash, now seemed like a distant memory. Rachel was already at her station, her movements sharp and erratic as she layered dark, stormy colors onto her canvas. Mr. Acker entered the room without a word, his presence as commanding as ever. He walked among the students, pausing occasionally to scrutinize their work. When he reached Ellie's station, he stood silently for a moment, his pale hand resting lightly on the edge of her canvas. "You're holding back," he said finally, his voice a quiet reprimand. "Fear is not something you can half-paint. It must consume the canvas, just as it consumes you." Ellie bit her lip, unsure how to respond. She glanced at her painting, a murky forest scene that felt as lifeless as her current state of mind. The truth was, she didn't know how to pour herself into her work the way Mr. Acker demanded. Fear was too abstract, too elusive to capture with paint. As the day wore on, the whispers returned, faint and intermittent. Ellie wasn't the only one who heard them this time. During a break, Rachel mentioned hearing her name called while she worked, though no one had been near her. Ben admitted to seeing movement in the corner of his eye, only to find the room empty when he turned. "It's this place," Rachel said, her voice low. "There's something wrong here." Ben laughed nervously. "Come on, it's an old building. Of course it's creepy." But his forced smile didn't reach his eyes, and Ellie could see the unease beneath his bravado. That evening, Ellie decided to stay late again, determined to make progress on her project. She couldn't afford to fall behind, no matter how unsettled she felt. The studio was eerily quiet as she worked, the only sound the soft scratching of her brush against the canvas. She was so focused on her painting that she didn't notice the shadows at first. They crept along the edges of the room, subtle and almost imperceptible. But as the minutes passed, they grew bolder, dark tendrils slithering across the walls like living things. Ellie froze, her brush slipping from her hand and clattering to the floor. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the room. The shadows moved in unnatural ways, defying the light sources and twisting into shapes that made her stomach churn. Her gaze drifted to the corner where the blank canvas stood. It wasn't blank anymore. A dark figure was taking shape on its surface, its edges blurry and indistinct as though it were being painted from the inside out. Ellie felt her breath catch, her heart hammering in her chest. The figure's head tilted slightly, and for a moment, she thought it was looking directly at her. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices overlapping and swirling around her. "Ellie," they murmured, "help us. Find us. Beware." The words tangled together, their meaning elusive but filled with a desperate urgency. Ellie stumbled back, her foot catching on the leg of her easel. She fell hard, the impact jarring her out of her paralysis. Scrambling to her feet, she grabbed her bag and bolted for the door, the whispers following her all the way to the hallway. As she stood outside the studio, gasping for breath, she felt a strange sense of relief mixed with dread. Whatever was happening in that room, it wasn't confined to her imagination. The canvas wasn't just waiting, it was alive. But alive with what? Ellie knew she couldn't keep running from the truth. Something dark was stirring in the Margrove School of Fine Arts, and whether she liked it or not, she was already entangled in its web. Ellie's nights were no longer restful. The dreams of the canvas plagued her sleep, each one more vivid than the last. The figure she'd seen now had eyes, dark, piercing, and disturbingly familiar. It watched her, its gaze a mixture of sorrow and menace, as if pleading for help while warning her to stay away. She would wake up drenched in sweat, the whispers from her dreams still echoing in her ears. By the time she returned to the studio, she felt like a ghost of herself, the bags under her eyes a stark contrast to her pale skin. Rachel noticed immediately. "You look awful," she said bluntly. Ellie shrugged. "Didn't sleep well?" Rachel frowned. "Me neither. I keep dreaming about people. Faces I don't recognize, but they feel familiar somehow." Ellie froze. "Familiar how?" Rachel hesitated, her voice lowering. "Like I've seen them before. In my paintings. But they're not things I've painted. They just appear." Ellie's stomach churned. She thought about the figure on the blank canvas, how it seemed to form itself out of thin air. "Do you think Mr. Acker knows something?" she asked. Rachel scoffed. "He's the one who's always pushing us to dig deeper, to find the truth in our fear. Maybe this is what he wants." The idea was chilling. Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Acker's relentless insistence on fear wasn't just about creating compelling art. There was something darker at play, something he wasn't telling them. That afternoon, Ellie couldn't bring herself to paint. The blank canvas before her felt like a threat, its empty surface taunting her with possibilities she didn't want to explore. Instead, she wandered around the studio, studying the other students' work. Ben's painting had changed drastically. What had once been an abstract depiction of anxiety now featured a shadowy figure looming in the background, its face obscured but unmistakably human. Ben didn't seem to notice. He worked furiously, his brush moving with a precision and speed that bordered on manic. Rachel's piece was equally unsettling. Her stormy landscape now had silhouettes, dozens of them, standing in the distance, their indistinct forms barely visible through the swirling clouds. "Do you see them too?" Rachel whispered when she caught Ellie staring. Ellie nodded, her mouth dry. The final straw came when Ellie noticed the paintings on the walls. They were part of the school's permanent collection, works from former students that had been hung as inspiration. But something about them was different now. The serene portraits and idyllic scenes had changed, subtle shifts that made them feel wrong. A shadow here, a flicker of movement there. It wasn't until she reached the end of the hall that she saw it. A painting she didn't recognize. It was massive, nearly floor to ceiling, and it depicted a group of students standing in the studio. They were painting, their faces captured in exquisite detail. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. The students in the painting looked familiar. Too familiar. She stepped closer, her eyes scanning the faces. There was Ben, his expression focused and intense. Rachel, her brow furrowed in concentration. And there, in the back corner, was Ellie herself. But there was something wrong. The students weren't alone. Standing among them was a shadowy figure, its features indistinct, but its presence undeniable. It stood behind Ellie's painted self, its hand resting on her shoulder. Ellie stumbled back, her heart racing. "What the hell is this?" she whispered. The whispers returned, louder now, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. "Help us, beware, find the truth." Ellie ran. She didn't stop until she was outside the building, the cool evening air biting at her skin. She leaned against the wall, gasping for breath, her mind racing. The painting hadn't just depicted the present. It had shown something darker, something that was creeping into their lives with every stroke of their brushes. And Ellie knew, deep down, that whatever was happening in the studio wasn't just supernatural. It was personal. Ellie couldn't stop thinking about the painting. The way it captured her likeness so vividly, the shadowy figure looming behind her. She felt exposed, like some unseen force had been watching her every move. She needed answers, and there was only one person who might have them, Mr. Acker. The following day, Ellie arrived at the studio early, her determination outweighing her fear. The sun had barely risen, casting long, gray shadows across the Margrove School of Fine Arts. She hesitated at the door to the studio, her hand hovering over the handle. The whispers were faint, barely audible, but they were there. They always were. Inside, the studio was eerily still, the canvases and easels standing like silent sentinels. Ellie made her way to Mr. Acker's office, her footsteps echoing in the empty halls. She had never been inside his office before. Students rarely had a reason to enter. The door was slightly ajar, and she hesitated before pushing it open. The room was dimly lit, a single desk lamp casting a warm glow over stacks of papers and books. Shelves lined the walls, crammed with art supplies, antique tools, and old sketchbooks. But what caught Ellie's attention were the paintings. They were everywhere, propped against the walls, hung in mismatched frames, and even stacked haphazardly in corners. Each one was more unsettling than the last. A woman standing in a field, her face obscured by shadows. A child holding a balloon, its string twisting into an ominous noose. A dark figure, faceless and featureless, reaching out toward the viewer. Ellie's eyes landed on a small painting sitting on Mr. Acker's desk. Her breath hitched. It was her, or at least it looked like her. The figure in the painting was sitting at an easel, painting furiously, while a shadow loomed behind her. It was almost identical to the larger painting she'd seen in the hallway. "You shouldn't be here." Ellie spun around to find Mr. Acker, standing in the doorway, his pale face unreadable. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a warning. "I need to know what's going on," Ellie said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "The paintings, the whispers, the shadows. What is this?" Mr. Acker stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. For a long moment, he didn't speak. Instead, he moved to his desk, picking up the painting of Ellie and holding it up to the light. "Art is not just a reflection of the soul," he said finally. "It is a gateway, a conduit between the seen and the unseen." He set the painting down and turned to Ellie. "You've felt it, haven't you? The pull, the way the paint moves almost on its own, revealing truths you didn't even know were inside you." Ellie nodded, her throat dry. Mr. Acker's expression softened, though it was far from reassuring. This school was built on that principle. The Margrove method isn't just about technique. It's about uncovering what lies beneath the surface. But sometimes, he trailed off, his gaze drifting to one of the shadowy paintings on the wall. Sometimes, the things we uncover aren't meant to be seen. Ellie's stomach turned. The whispers, the shadows, are they real? "They are echoes," Mr. Acker said. "Remnants of those who came before you. Students who dug too deeply, who let their fear consume them." "Consume them?" Ellie repeated, her voice rising. "What happened to them?" Mr. Acker sighed, his face betraying a flicker of regret. "They became part of the art, trapped in a sense. Their essence lingers in the paint, in the canvases. They speak through the brushstrokes, trying to warn those who come after." Ellie felt her knees weaken. The faces Rachel had seen in her dreams, the shadowy figures in Ben's painting. They weren't just figments of their imagination. They were real. "Why didn't you stop it?" Ellie demanded, anger rising in her chest. "Because it cannot be stopped," Mr. Acker said, his voice low. "The only way to survive is to keep painting, to finish the story the shadows demand." Ellie took a step back, her mind reeling. She had come for answers, but she was leaving with more questions and a growing sense of dread. The Margrove School of Fine Arts wasn't just a place to learn. It was a trap, and she was already ensnared. Ellie left Mr. Acker's office with a heavy weight pressing on her chest. His cryptic explanations replayed in her mind, their implications growing darker with every step. She wandered the hallways of the studio, her eyes darting to the paintings that adorned the walls. Each brushstroke seemed alive now, as though the art was watching her just as intently as she was watching it. When she entered the main studio, she found Rachel and Ben already there. They were quiet, their usual chatter replaced by an uneasy silence. Rachel was hunched over her easel, her brush moving mechanically, while Ben stared blankly at his painting. Both of their canvases had changed dramatically since Ellie last saw them. Rachel's stormy landscape now included dozens of shadowy figures, their features more defined, their postures twisted and unnatural. Ben's abstract chaos had solidified into something horrifying, a monstrous figure with elongated limbs and empty eyes, its hand outstretched toward the viewer. "You see it, don't you?" Rachel's voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a knife. Ellie hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "I see something," she admitted, her voice faltering. "It's not just in the paintings," Ben said, his tone flat. He didn't look up from his canvas. "It's everywhere. I feel it when I sleep, when I'm alone, even when I'm around other people. Like it's watching me, waiting for something." Ellie wanted to deny it, to reassure them that everything was fine, but she couldn't. She had seen the same shadows, felt the same whispers crawling beneath her skin. And now she knew the truth. Those shadows weren't just figments of their imagination. They were the remnants of the students who had come before them, trapped in the art they created. "What are we supposed to do?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. "We can't just stop painting. It's like it won't let us." Ellie thought of Mr. Acker's warning. The only way to survive is to keep painting. But what did survival mean in a place like this? To keep painting was to dig deeper into the darkness, to risk becoming part of it. And yet to stop was unthinkable. The pull of the canvas was irresistible, as if something beyond her control was guiding her hand. As if on cue, Ellie felt the overwhelming urge to return to her easel. Her unfinished painting stood in the corner, its blank surface now seeming to shimmer faintly, like a mirage. She approached it slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. When she picked up her brush, it felt heavier than before, as though it carried the weight of the shadows themselves. She hesitated, staring at the canvas, but the pull was too strong. Her hand began to move, the brush gliding over the surface with an urgency that wasn't entirely her own. At first, the strokes were aimless, chaotic, but soon, a form began to emerge. A figure, tall and thin, with elongated limbs and a face shrouded in darkness. Ellie's breath quickened as she realized she wasn't painting from her imagination. She was painting what she had seen in her dreams. The whispers grew louder, their voices overlapping in a chaotic chorus. Ellie's hand moved faster, her strokes more frantic. She wasn't in control anymore. The painting was taking shape on its own, the figure growing more detailed, more lifelike. And then it happened. The figure on the canvas moved. It was subtle at first, a flicker of its shadow, a shift in its posture. Ellie froze, her brush hovering in midair, her heart racing. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a suffocating silence. Ellie, Rachel's voice broke through the stillness, trembling with fear. "It's happening to yours too." Ellie turned slowly, her eyes wide. Rachel and Ben were staring at their own paintings, their faces pale and stricken. The figures on their canvases were moving as well, their dark forms twisting and writhing as though trying to escape the confines of the paint. The studio grew colder, the air heavy with an oppressive energy. Ellie felt it pressing against her chest, making it hard to breathe. And then, as if in response to the collective fear in the room, the shadows on the walls began to shift. One by one, the shadowy figures stepped out of the paintings. Ellie stumbled back, her heart pounding in her ears. The figures moved slowly, deliberately, their forms indistinct but undeniably menacing. They didn't speak, but their intent was clear. They were coming for the students. In that moment, Ellie realized the truth. This wasn't just about the art or the whispers. The shadows didn't want to be painted. They wanted to be free, and they would stop at nothing to escape. The figures from the paintings stood before them, their forms both undefined and deeply unsettling. They wavered like smoke, yet exuded a tangible malevolence. Ellie, Rachel, and Ben froze, unable to process the impossible reality unfolding in the studio. The only sound was the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, flickering as if the power itself was succumbing to the presence of these otherworldly entities. Rachel was the first to scream, her voice shattering the eerie silence. She bolted for the door, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. Ben followed, but Ellie stood rooted to the spot, her gaze fixed on the figures. Something in her gut told her that running wouldn't work. The studio itself felt alive now, pulsating with an energy that seemed to originate from the shadows. "Ellie!" Ben shouted from the doorway, snapping her out of her trance. "Come on!" She turned and sprinted after them, the air around her thick and oppressive. The figures didn't chase them. Instead, they seemed to merge with the walls, their dark forms stretching and twisting as though becoming part of the studio itself. The three of them burst into the hallway, slamming the door shut behind them. Rachel leaned against the wall, gasping for air, her face pale and streaked with tears. "What the hell is happening?" she cried, her voice trembling. Ben shook his head, his hands gripping his knees as he tried to catch his breath. "I don't know, but we need to get out of here. Now!" Ellie glanced back at the studio door, half expecting it to burst open. But the hallway was quiet, the oppressive energy momentarily absent. "It's not just the paintings," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's this place. It's alive." "What do you mean alive?" Rachel snapped, her fear morphing into anger. "Buildings don't just come to life, Ellie. This is something else." Ellie hesitated, unsure how to explain the overwhelming sense of awareness she had felt. "Mr. Acker knows something," she finally said. "He tried to warn me earlier, but he wouldn't say much. He just kept talking about survival and painting." Rachel and Ben exchanged uneasy glances. "So, what do we do?" Ben asked. "Go back to him? He's clearly part of this, whatever this is." Before Ellie could respond, The lights in the hallway flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. The air grew colder, and the faint sound of whispers returned, echoing all around them. Ellie's heart raced as she realized the whispers weren't coming from a single direction. They were everywhere. A dim, unnatural light began to seep through the cracks in the walls, illuminating the hallway in a sickly green glow. The shadows moved again, emerging from the corners and stretching toward them. This time, the figures were more defined, their forms sharper and more menacing. "Run!" Ellie shouted, grabbing Rachel's arm and pulling her down the hallway. Ben followed, their footsteps pounding against the floor as the shadows closed in. They turned a corner and stumbled into the main lobby of the school. The familiar space was now unrecognizable, its walls covered in pulsating black veins that seemed to writhe like living things. The paintings on the walls had changed as well, their subjects twisted and grotesque, their eyes following the students as they moved. The front door was just ahead, but as they approached, the veins crept across the floor, blocking their path. Ellie skidded to a stop, her heart sinking. The building wasn't going to let them leave. "We're trapped," Rachel whispered, her voice shaking. "No," Ellie said, her mind racing. "There has to be a way out. We just have to think." The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as the shadows closed in. Ellie glanced around the room, her eyes landing on a stairwell leading to the upper floors. It was their only option. "Upstairs," she shouted, grabbing Rachel and Ben and pulling them toward the stairs. As they ascended, the oppressive energy grew stronger, each step feeling heavier than the last. Ellie could feel the shadows pressing in, their presence suffocating. But she also felt something else, a strange pull, like an invisible thread guiding her toward an unknown destination. Whatever was happening in the studio wasn't random. It was deliberate, calculated, and Ellie was determined to uncover the truth, even if it meant confronting the darkness head-on. The stairwell spiraled upward into darkness, its narrow walls closing in with every step. Ellie led the way, her hand gripping the cold metal railing as if it could tether her to sanity. Behind her, Rachel and Ben struggled to keep their panic in check, their labored breathing echoing against the stone walls. The whispers followed them, growing louder, like a chorus of unseen voices urging them to turn back. "Where does this even go?" Rachel hissed, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "I don't know," Ellie replied, her voice tense. But staying down there wasn't an option. As they climbed, the light dimmed until the only illumination came from the sickly green glow seeping through cracks in the walls. The air grew heavier, carrying a faint metallic tang that made Ellie's stomach churn. When they reached the top, a rusted door loomed before them, its surface etched with strange, jagged symbols. "This doesn't look right," Ben muttered, stepping back instinctively. Ellie reached for the handle, hesitating as the whispers crescendoed into an almost deafening roar. She turned to Rachel and Ben, her expression resolute. "We don't have a choice. Whatever's happening, the answers are in here." The moment Ellie pushed the door open, an icy wind rushed past them, carrying the faint scent of turpentine and decay. They stepped into a cavernous room that seemed impossibly large, given the school's modest exterior. The walls were lined with shelves crammed with ancient books, jars of paint, and unidentifiable objects that glistened in the dim light. At the center of the room stood a massive easel, its canvas blank but pulsating faintly, as if it were alive. Surrounding the easel was a circle of black candles, their flames flickering unnaturally. Ellie's eyes were drawn to the floor, where the same jagged symbols from the door were carved into the wood, forming an intricate pattern that seemed to shift when she looked at it. "This is some kind of ritual space," Ellie said, her voice barely above a whisper. Rachel moved closer to the shelves, her curiosity momentarily overpowering her fear. She picked up a tattered notebook, its leather cover cracked with age. Flipping through its pages, she gasped. "These are Mr. Acker's sketches, but they're different. These aren't just art. They're instructions." Ellie joined her, scanning the pages. The sketches depicted grotesque figures and warped landscapes, interspersed with lines of text written in a language she didn't recognize. One page caught her attention, a detailed drawing of the studio they had fled from, its walls covered in the same pulsating veins they had seen downstairs. Beneath the drawing, a single phrase was written in bold, jagged letters. "The artist must feed the canvas." "What does that mean?" Ben asked, his voice trembling. Before Ellie could respond, the candles around the easel flared, their flames rising impossibly high. The blank canvas began to shimmer, colors swirling across its surface like liquid. Shapes emerged, vague at first, then sharpening into a scene of the three of them standing in the very room they were in. "That's us," Rachel whispered, stepping back in horror. Ellie's breath caught in her throat as the painted version of herself turned to face the real her, its eyes black and soulless. The figure raised a hand, pointing directly at Ellie. The canvas rippled, and the painted figures began to move, stepping out of the frame one by one. The room plunged into chaos as the painted doppelgangers advanced, their movements jerky and unnatural. Ellie grabbed a jar of paint thinner from a nearby shelf and hurled it at the nearest figure. The liquid splashed across its body, dissolving the paint and causing it to shriek in agony. "They're vulnerable to this stuff," Ellie shouted, grabbing another jar. Rachel and Ben followed her lead, frantically searching for anything they could use as a weapon. The battle was chaotic, the room filled with the sounds of shattering glass and the unearthly wails of the painted creatures. When the last figure dissolved into a puddle of paint on the floor, the room fell silent. Ellie leaned against the wall, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. "This isn't just a curse or a haunted building," she said. "This is deliberate. Someone made this happen." Rachel held up the notebook, her hands shaking, and Mr. Acker is at the center of it. As they stood in the eerie silence, the easel began to hum, its canvas reforming into another blank slate. The jagged symbols on the floor glowed faintly, and the whispers returned, now laced with a menacing edge. Ellie tightened her grip on the notebook. Whatever was happening in the school wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about stopping whatever malevolent force had been unleashed. And if the notebook was right, Mr. Acker held the key to everything. The three of them sat on the cold floor of the forbidden room, the notebook open between them like a damning artifact. Ellie's hands shook as she traced the jagged lines of Mr. Acker's sketches. Each page seemed to exude a sense of foreboding, as though the art itself was alive. The air around them felt heavier now, weighted by the unspoken knowledge that the painter they had trusted was at the center of something monstrous. "We can't stay here," Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes darted nervously to the blank canvas on the easel, still shimmering faintly as though waiting for its next victim. "This place is wrong." Ellie nodded, but her gaze lingered on the sketches. One in particular caught her attention. It depicted a group of students, their faces twisted in agony, trapped within what looked like a massive mural. Surrounding them were jagged symbols identical to the ones etched into the floor. Below the image, a single sentence was scrawled in bold, uneven handwriting. To preserve their beauty, they must never leave the frame. "Look at this," Ellie said, holding up the page. Ben and Rachel leaned in, their expressions darkening as they took in the haunting image. "It's them," Ben murmured, pointing to the faces in the sketch. "The students who disappeared last year. The ones everyone thought dropped out. That's why there were no police reports. Acker didn't let them leave. He trapped them here." Rachel recoiled, her face pale. "That can't be true. It's just a drawing, right? It doesn't mean." Her voice trailed off as the realization sank in. Everything they had seen, the pulsating veins in the walls, the living doppelgangers, had already proven that this was no ordinary school. Ellie snapped the notebook shut, determination hardening her features. "We need to find Acker and stop this. Whatever he's doing, it ends tonight." The group descended the spiral staircase, their footsteps echoing ominously. The whispers seemed to follow them, growing louder and more insistent with each step. As they reached the ground floor, the air grew colder, and the once familiar hallways twisted unnaturally, their angles bending in impossible ways. "Does anyone else feel like the building is watching us?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. Ben nodded, his eyes scanning the warped corridors. It's like it's alive, like it knows what we're trying to do. They followed the trail of veins that pulsed faintly along the walls, leading them toward the heart of the school. The veins seemed to converge at the main studio, their glow intensifying with each step. When they reached the studio door, Ellie hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. "Whatever's in there, we need to be ready," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. She glanced at the paint thinner bottles they had salvaged from the ritual room. "If he's like those things we saw earlier, this might be our only defense." Rachel and Ben nodded, gripping their own makeshift weapons. Ellie pushed the door open, and the three of them stepped inside. The studio was unrecognizable. The walls were covered in massive murals, each one depicting scenes of anguish and despair. Faces stared out from the paintings, their expressions frozen in silent screams. Ellie recognized some of them, students who had vanished over the years. The room reeked of turpentine and something fouler, a cloying scent that made her stomach churn. At the center of the room stood Mr. Acker, his back to them, as he worked feverishly on a massive canvas. His movements were frantic, almost inhuman, as he painted with a brush dipped in a thick, dark substance that glistened like oil. "Acker!" Ellie shouted, her voice cutting through the oppressive silence. The teacher froze, his brush hovering over the canvas. Slowly, he turned to face them, his eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. His face was gaunt, his skin stretched tightly over his cheekbones. He smiled, but there was no warmth in it, only malice. "Ah, my prodigies," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "You've discovered my little secret." Ellie stepped forward, gripping the bottle of paint thinner tightly. "This isn't art, Acker. This is murder." Acker chuckled a low, chilling sound. "Murder? No, my dear. This is immortality. These students, their beauty, their essence, it's all preserved here in my work. They live forever through me." "Let them go," Rachel demanded, her voice shaking. "Whatever you've done, it's not too late to stop." Acker's smile widened, his eyes glinting with amusement. "Stop? Why would I stop? I'm creating perfection. You should feel honored to be a part of it." Before they could react, Acker raised his brush, and the murals on the walls began to ripple. The painted figures stirred, their frozen faces contorting as they turned toward the intruders. Ellie's heart pounded as she realized they were no longer trapped within the frames. They were coming for them. The room erupted into chaos as the painted figures stepped out of the murals, their bodies dripping with thick, oozing paint. Ellie hurled a bottle of thinner at the nearest one, watching as it dissolved into a puddle of color. But for every figure they destroyed, more emerged from the walls. "We need to get out of here," Ben shouted, throwing another bottle at the advancing figures. Ellie locked eyes with Acker, who stood in the center of the chaos, his laughter ringing out like a sinister symphony. She knew then that this was only the beginning. Whatever power he had tapped into was far beyond their understanding, and if they didn't stop him, they might be the next additions to his grotesque masterpiece. As Ellie, Rachel, and Ben fled the studio, the walls behind them continued to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, as though the building itself was alive. The figure that had once been Mr. Acker stood unmoving in the center of the chaos, his body still in the midst of a grotesque transformation. The paint dripping from his form seemed to shimmer with a life of its own, moving in ways that defied logic. The trio raced down the hallways, their breath shallow and their legs burning from the effort. There was no time for questions, only survival. "We can't outrun them," Rachel gasped, glancing over her shoulder at the advancing painted figures. They were moving at an eerie speed, their features grotesque as their bodies continued to drip with dark paint, more and more escaping the confines of the murals that had birthed them. Ben, who had taken the lead, threw open the first door he could find and ushered the others into a small, dusty classroom. They huddled behind the desk, catching their breath. The eerie sound of footsteps, the irregular tapping of paint-covered feet, echoed down the hallway. Every now and then, they could hear a low, mournful sound, almost like a whisper from the figures themselves, as though they were reaching out, beckoning. "We need a plan," Ellie said, her voice shaking. She couldn't shake the image of the people she had once known, now part of Acker's twisted gallery. She had always been skeptical of the power of art, but now it was clear to her that Acker was no mere teacher. He was a monster, using his craft to hold his students captive, painting them into eternal suffering. Rachel rubbed her temples, trying to steady her breathing. We have to destroy the murals. But how? We've tried everything we could think of, and we barely made it out of there alive. Ben slumped against the wall, his eyes wide with the weight of their situation. What if the power comes from the paint itself? What if it's not just Acker that's the problem, but the very medium he uses? Ellie's gaze sharpened as she processed his words. The paint, she murmured. It's not just ink or oil. It's alive. It moves. It reacts. It's what binds them to this world. Rachel frowned. So what? If we destroy the paint, the curse is broken? We have to try, Ellie said, her resolve hardening. But how do we destroy something that seems to have a life of its own? For a moment, no one spoke. The classroom was suffocatingly silent, the tension thick in the air. Then Ben straightened up, his face lighting up with an idea. What if Acker's paintings are connected to his power? What if the only way to truly stop him is to destroy the source of his creations, his original masterpiece? Ellie looked at him with a mixture of skepticism and hope. You mean the mural in his office? The one we saw earlier? Ben nodded. It makes sense. If he's using his art to bind the souls of his students, then his most important creation, the one that holds the key to his immortality, must be the one with the most power. Rachel hesitated, her eyes darting toward the door. But we don't know where that mural is. We've only seen a few parts of the school, and it's changing with every step we take. Ellie's heart raced, but she knew they had no choice. They couldn't keep running. They had to face Acker and his twisted creation head-on. We'll have to find it, and this time, we need to be prepared. We need to destroy the heart of his power before he can do any more damage. The group set out once more, this time moving with purpose. They knew the danger was high, but the knowledge of their only option gave them focus. Each corridor they turned down felt unfamiliar, as if the very structure of the building was working against them, shifting and bending as if to trap them. Every creak in the floorboards, every flicker of the overhead lights, only heightened their sense of dread. It wasn't long before they stumbled upon a hallway that felt different from the others. The air seemed colder here, and the whispers, the soft, insistent murmurs, grew louder the further they went. Ellie could almost make out words, but they were distorted, slithering in her ears like an endless chant. "Do you hear that?" Rachel asked, her voice hushed as if afraid to speak too loudly. "It's like the walls are trying to tell us something." Ben nodded, his face pale as he leaned in closer to the walls. He could see faint shapes, figures locked in a desperate, eternal struggle, etched into the surfaces around them. It was as though the very walls were made of Acker's paint, holding the trapped souls of past students. Ellie's stomach twisted in response. "There it is," Ellie said suddenly, pointing toward a door at the far end of the hall. It was slightly ajar, and a faint light spilled out from the crack. Her heart raced as she moved toward it. They entered the room cautiously, and there it was, the original masterpiece. The mural covered the entire wall, a sprawling depiction of the school, its halls, and its students. But it wasn't a simple painting. It was a distorted, chaotic image of agony and despair, filled with countless faces, all twisted in pain and terror. Ellie could see Acker, his figure larger than life in the center, smiling serenely amidst the chaos. And in the eyes of every painted figure, she could see a reflection of their trapped souls, trapped and screaming, frozen in the colors of the paint. "This is it," Ellie whispered. "This is where it all started." Ben stepped forward, his eyes locked on the mural. "We need to destroy it. If we break the mural, we break his hold on this place." Ellie nodded, her fingers trembling as she grabbed the bottle of paint thinner they had carried. The group stepped back as she threw the contents onto the canvas. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the paint began to sizzle, the colors bubbling and popping as the mural started to disintegrate before their eyes. The room seemed to tremble, as if the very foundation of the school was coming apart. The laughter of Acker, once haunting, turned into a blood-curdling shriek as the painting melted away. As the last remnants of the mural bubbled and dissolved into a pool of dark, inky liquid, the trio stood frozen, their eyes wide with disbelief. The once unyielding figures within the painting seemed to fade into the blackness of the room, but there was no release, no moment of peace. The room quaked under the weight of Acker's wrath, as though the very walls were alive and reacting to the destruction. The air was thick with tension, and the taste of burning paint still lingered on their tongues. "Is it over?" Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising chaos. She had been waiting for a sign, for some indication that the curse was lifted, that Acker's twisted hold had finally been broken. But nothing had changed. The silence in the room felt more oppressive than the screams they had heard before. Ellie shook her head, feeling a deep sense of foreboding. "I don't think so. If anything, we've just triggered something worse." Her words were like a prophecy, for as soon as the final stroke of the mural was gone, the temperature in the room plummeted. The walls seemed to close in on them, pulsating with a sickening rhythm as the shadows themselves twisted and formed grotesque shapes. Then, a voice, a hollow, echoing sound, broke the silence. "You think you've won?" It was Mr. Acker's voice, but it was distorted as though it came from the depths of some nightmare. It reverberated in their minds, leaving them disoriented and terrified. "You cannot destroy me. I am the paint, and the paint is me." Suddenly, the walls seemed to stretch and twist around them. The room was no longer static. It was alive, breathing. The door through which they had entered slammed shut, and the once familiar classroom transformed into an eerie, shifting gallery of horrors. Paintings now adorned the walls, but they were not like the ones before. These were grotesque, abstract, constantly changing, reflecting the deepest fears and darkest thoughts of the students who had fallen prey to Acker's curse. Ben stumbled backward, his hand gripping the edge of a desk for support. "We've unleashed something," he muttered, barely able to process what was happening. "This isn't just a school anymore. It's a prison. It's his prison." Ellie's eyes widened as she noticed something that chilled her to the bone. The figures from the mural, the students who had once been trapped within the painted scenes, now stood before them, no longer confined to the walls. They were free, or at least as free as they could be, their bodies grotesque and deformed, their eyes wide with terror. They didn't speak. They simply stared, a constant reminder of the torment Acker had inflicted on them. "It's him," Ellie whispered, recognizing the flickering figure in the back of the room. Acker himself. His form was shifting, no longer the man they had known, but something far darker, something that defied the laws of nature. His once human features were melting and distorting as though they were painted with too much color, too much life. He's become the painting. The air in the room thickened as Acker's twisted form took shape. He stood now impossibly tall, with limbs that stretched unnaturally, draped in layers of thick, dripping paint. His smile, once warm and reassuring, had become a horrifying mockery, a cruel sneer that seemed to pierce through their souls. "You've come so far," Acker's voice hissed, now echoing from every direction. "But you've only played into my hands. The paint does not obey your will. It obeys mine." Ben grabbed Ellie's arm, his face pale with terror. "We need to get out of here. We can't fight him. He's become part of this place." But Ellie wasn't listening. Her gaze was fixed on Acker, who now seemed to float before them, his body merging with the very walls of the room. The paintings around them began to warp, their figures stretching and twitching, each one seemingly alive. It was as if Acker's curse had expanded, consuming everything it touched. "We can't run," Ellie said, her voice steady now, though the terror still lurked beneath the surface. "If we don't stop him here, this place will keep consuming everything. The students, the teachers, the town, maybe the whole world." Rachel looked at Ellie, her eyes wide with uncertainty, but she knew the truth in Ellie's words. If they didn't confront Acker now, they would never escape. "How do we stop him?" she asked, her voice breaking through the chaos of the room. Ellie turned to face her, determination in her eyes. "The paint," she said simply. We have to destroy it. All of it. Every drop. It's the only way. The room seemed to pulse, reacting to her words, as though the very fabric of reality was bending under the weight of their confrontation. Acker's form flickered again, the grotesque figure shifting as he towered over them. "You think you can destroy me?" he hissed. "The paint is eternal. You are nothing but a passing moment. I am timeless." Without warning, Acker reached out, his hand a blotch of dark paint that seemed to stretch into infinity. The room quaked violently, and the shadows in the corners seemed to grow, twisting toward the trio. Ellie, however, was already moving. She grabbed a nearby paintbrush, one that had somehow remained untouched through the chaos, and dipped it into the pool of paint that had once been the mural. "I don't care how timeless you think you are," she muttered, gripping the brush tightly. "This ends now." With one swift motion, she lunged at the floor, slashing the brush through the thick paint. The room screamed as the ground beneath them cracked, and the walls began to tremble. The paint, once alive, began to recoil, as if it was aware of the threat to its existence. But it was too late. The first stroke shattered the illusion. The tremors in the room had not subsided. The air was thick with an unnatural hum, and the walls seemed to shimmer as though they were not made of stone and plaster, but of liquid. Ellie's heart raced as she struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what they had just done. The brush in her hand trembled, her fingers stiff from the power of the moment. She had thought, for a fleeting second, that the paint, the very thing that had imprisoned them all, would recoil and disappear, as though it were some kind of living entity. But instead, it had responded with anger, its blackness deepening, swirling and lashing against the very fabric of reality itself. The ground beneath their feet groaned, and a sharp, stinging cold filled the room, despite the heat that had earlier suffused it. The once vibrant and terrifying murals began to dissolve into more liquid paint, splashing across the floor, pooling like a sea of ink. Each splash sounded like a heartbeat. It was as though the entire room had turned into a canvas, a massive, living, breathing painting that responded to every movement, every thought. "I don't think we're in control here anymore," Rachel said, her voice quivering, breaking through the chaotic scene. She was gripping the edge of a desk, her face pale as she looked at Ellie. Her eyes betrayed a deep sense of confusion, but also a growing realization. "Ellie, what did you just do?" Ellie couldn't answer immediately. She was too caught up in the strange new reality unfolding around them. The room had split open in a way she couldn't understand. What was once a familiar school space had now become something else, a distorted, broken reflection of itself. The black paint had splattered across the walls, merging with the very atmosphere of the room, turning everything it touched into a grotesque version of what it once had been. Ben, who had been silent for the past few moments, finally spoke up. "This is it. We've entered his world. The painting, it's alive now. Everything we've seen, everything we've heard, it's not real. It's his domain." His voice was low, almost as if speaking too loudly would shatter the fragile illusion they were now trapped in. As his words hung in the air, the world around them seemed to pulse. The paintings, the grotesque murals of former students that had seemed so lifelike moments before, began to twist into new shapes. Figures that had once been static now moved with disturbing fluidity, their eyes shifting and following the group. The shadows in the corners grew longer, darker, as if feeding off the chaos they had unleashed. Ellie's heart pounded as she realized what was happening. The mural was only a doorway, she whispered, the words barely escaping her lips. Acker didn't just trap us in his art. He was using the paint as a way to cross into our world. To make it his own, the silence that followed was suffocating. The realization hung between them, heavy and unavoidable. But before any of them could speak again, something more horrifying happened. A low growl filled the air, coming from the center of the room, where the last remnants of Acker's paint pooled on the floor. And then the figure emerged. It was him, Acker, but not as they had known him. His form was no longer human. It was a monstrous abstraction, a grotesque parody of the man they had once feared. His body was a mass of shifting lines, blackened streaks, and thick pools of ink that seemed to swirl in and out of existence. His eyes were the only part of him that remained static, two hollow, empty voids that gazed at them with an insatiable hunger. You thought you could escape. Acker's voice echoed through the room, but it wasn't just his voice. It was the paint itself speaking through him. It was everywhere, reverberating through the walls, the floor, the very air they breathed. You've only made it worse. I am no longer bound by the canvas. I am the canvas. I am everywhere. Ellie took a step back, her mind racing. She could feel the weight of his presence, pressing down on them from all directions. The paint on the floor writhed and twisted, reaching out as if it had a life of its own. It slithered up the walls, pulling at the edges of reality, threatening to consume everything. And with each second that passed, the room became more and more distorted, shifting between dimensions like a fever dream. This place, it's collapsing, Ellie murmured, her hand instinctively reaching for Ben's. Her thoughts were scattered. If Acker was the painting, if he had become part of it, then the room itself was his creation. They were inside his mind, his world, and it was falling apart. Rachel, still holding onto the desk for support, lifted her head to look at Acker's distorted form. "What do you want from us?" she demanded, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and anger. "Why are you doing this?" Acker's laugh was a twisted, guttural sound that seemed to echo from every direction, reverberating within their skulls. "You should have known," he hissed. "The paint is not just a medium for creation. It is a tool for control. And now, it is all that remains. You are nothing more than a fleeting moment in the canvas of my eternal existence." Ellie knew they were running out of time. The room was collapsing further, the walls warping and melting like wax in a flame. She could feel the air growing thinner, the pressure mounting. The door, the only way out, was no longer visible. It had been consumed by the overwhelming tide of black ink that now filled the room. "We have to destroy the paint," Ellie said, her voice sharp with determination. "This is the only way. We have to burn it, tear it down, do whatever it takes." But the room was fighting back. The floor shifted under their feet, and the very walls seemed to pulse with an angry energy. The paint that had once been their hope was now an all-encompassing darkness, feeding off their every thought, every fear. Acker's eyes glowed with a malevolent light as he took another step toward them. "You think you can defeat me?" His words hung in the air like poison. "The more you fight, the stronger I become. The paint feeds off you. It is you who are trapped here now." Ellie looked around desperately. The mural, the paint, it was no longer just his creation. It was their creation too. They had become part of it. The room had become a prison, its walls no longer static, but a fluid extension of the chaos that had overtaken it. As Ellie, Rachel, and Ben stood in the center of the distorted classroom, they could feel the very air shift around them, thick with the oppressive weight of Acker's malignant presence. The paint, which had once seemed to be just a medium for his creations, was now the very essence of their confinement. It had grown, expanded, and woven itself into every corner of the room, forming an intricate web of ink that not only kept them in place, but also manipulated the very nature of their reality. Acker's form, that shifting, monstrous abstraction, hovered above them like a dark cloud. His eyes, two endless, void-like pits, stared into them with unblinking malice, each of them feeling as though the weight of his gaze was pulling them deeper into the very fabric of the nightmarish world he had crafted. Ellie's thoughts were disjointed, fractured by the overwhelming presence of the entity they faced. The very ground beneath their feet no longer felt solid. It seemed to ripple like water, threatening to swallow them whole. "We can't stay here much longer," Ben said, his voice barely audible over the low hum that now filled the room. The tension in his words was palpable. His eyes darted around the room, trying to find any clue, any possible escape, but everything was engulfed in a sea of black paint. "There's no way out, Ellie. This place, it's not real anymore. It's just an extension of him." Ellie's heart pounded in her chest. Ben was right. The room, once a familiar space, had transformed into something otherworldly, a physical manifestation of Acker's twisted mind. The paintings on the walls, once grotesque representations of former students, had become more than just images. They had become traps, pulsating and breathing like living things. Figures moved within them, their eyes following the trio, their mouths gaping in silent screams as though they, too, were trapped within the paint. As Ellie looked around, she realized the magnitude of what Acker had done. The paint had become the canvas, yes, but it was also the prison. The more they struggled, the more it consumed them. Acker had not only imprisoned them physically, but had woven their very consciousness into the fabric of his creation. They were not just in his world. They were part of it, each thought, each breath feeding the canvas, making it more powerful, more alive. Ellie, do you remember? Rachel's voice broke through Ellie's thoughts, trembling but clear. The mural in the back room, it wasn't just a doorway. It was a warning. Acker knew what he was doing. He didn't just trap us here. He's been pulling us into this nightmare from the very beginning. Ellie turned to Rachel, her expression hardening with the sudden clarity of her words. The mural, the one they had thought was simply a piece of his madness, was not just a painting. It had been a tool, a lure. Acker had been planning this all along, pulling them into his web of darkness, slowly unraveling the world they had once known. But why? Why them? What had they done to deserve this torment? Before Ellie could speak, a sharp crack echoed through the room, followed by a low rumble. The floor beneath them trembled, and the walls seemed to stretch, contorting as if being pulled by invisible hands. The paintings on the walls began to twist and writhe violently, the colors bleeding into one another, forming grotesque shapes and figures that flickered in and out of existence. The air thickened, and with each passing second, the room felt less like a physical space and more like a diseased mind, a mind that was slowly consuming itself. Ellie stepped back instinctively, her mind racing. The only way out, if there was a way out, was to destroy the paint, to tear apart the very thing that held them captive. But how? The paint was everywhere, in every corner of the room, in every crack and crevice. It was not just a medium of Acker's creation, it was a manifestation of his power, his control. Do you feel it? Rachel whispered, her eyes wide with fear. The walls, they're closing in? Ellie's stomach twisted. She could feel it too. The walls were not just closing in physically. They were closing in on their minds, their very perceptions of reality. The paint, the darkness, it was spreading beyond the room now, seeping into their thoughts, their memories. Each moment they spent here, trapped within Acker's creation, was a moment they lost themselves. Their identities, their sense of who they were being erased by the very thing they had once believed could be controlled. The art, the paint. Acker's laughter echoed again, louder this time, reverberating through the walls like a wave crashing over them. His form shimmered, flickering like a glitch in a broken system. You still think you can escape? His voice was everywhere, inside their heads, in their hearts. This is not just my world, it is your world now. You've become part of the paint, part of the canvas. There is no escape from it. You are already here, in the tapestry of despair I've woven. The longer you resist, the more you will fade. Ellie felt a surge of desperation, a burning need to fight back, to reclaim her agency, her sense of self. But she knew, deep down, that fighting was no longer enough. They had crossed the point of no return. The paint had consumed them, and now it was only a matter of how much longer they would remain themselves before they were lost entirely. "This isn't over," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It was a promise, not just to Acker, but to herself and the others. They had to find a way out of this. They had to destroy the canvas before it destroyed them. But how? As the room seemed to collapse further into madness, Ellie's gaze fell on the broken remnants of the once solid walls. They weren't just walls anymore. They were barriers, thresholds between realities, between the world they had known and the nightmare Acker had created. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was still a way to break through. But the answer, if it existed, was hidden within the paint. And the more they struggled, the more Acker's world began to reflect their fear, their panic. They had become part of it now, But that didn't mean they were powerless. They had to hold on to something, anything, to keep their minds intact. Or else, they would join the countless others who had been absorbed by Acker's painted world, lost to the ever-expanding tapestry of despair. As the walls of Acker's world continued to warp and breathe with unnatural life, Ellie, Rachel, and Ben stood motionless, their minds reeling with the realization that they were not merely trapped in a room, but in the very fabric of Acker's creation. What had once been a classroom filled with the smells of oil paint and the rustle of sketchbooks was now an unfathomable nightmare, a place where the laws of reality no longer applied. The room seemed alive, pulsing with the sinister energy that Acker had infused into it, his presence hanging over them like a shadow, constant and suffocating. Ellie's heart thudded loudly in her chest, the oppressive silence of the room making each beat seem impossibly loud. The paint had ceased to be a medium for creation. It had become an extension of Acker himself, a physical manifestation of his twisted imagination. The walls seemed to close in with every breath they took, the air thick with the stench of decay. It was as though the paint itself had become a parasite, feeding on their fear and slowly creeping into their minds. "He's toying with us," Rachel whispered, her voice quivering. This isn't just about the paint anymore. It's about control. He wants us to break, to lose ourselves in this nightmare." Ellie looked around, her eyes darting from the flickering paintings to the dark, swirling mass of paint that covered the floor. She could feel it, the pull of the darkness, a magnetic force drawing her deeper into its depths. She had to stay focused. They all had to stay focused. But the more she looked at the paintings, the more the figures within them seemed to move, to come alive. They weren't just static images anymore. They were a reflection of Acker's mind, his soul, and they were waiting for her, beckoning her into their world. Ben's voice broke through her thoughts. "We need to figure out how to fight back. This place, it's not real. It's all in his mind. If we can somehow sever that connection, maybe we can escape." His words hung in the air, but they felt hollow. Escape? How could they escape from something that wasn't confined to a single room? Acker had woven them into the very fabric of his art. The idea of escape seemed as distant and impossible as the world they had once known. Ellie's mind reeled with the enormity of their situation, but somewhere in the back of her mind, a flicker of determination began to grow. There had to be a way out. There had to be a weakness, something they could exploit. She turned to Rachel and Ben, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. "If we're part of this creation now, we need to understand it. Acker's paintings, they're not just images. They're his mind, his consciousness. If we can figure out how he thinks, maybe we can unravel the world he's built." Rachel nodded, her eyes narrowing as she glanced around the room. "It's like he's feeding off our fear. The more we resist, the stronger this place becomes. But if we stop being afraid, if we stop seeing it as a threat, maybe we can take the power away from it." Ellie considered her words. Could it really be that simple? Could the key to escaping this nightmare lie in changing their perception, in taking away Acker's power over them? She had seen it in the way the paintings seemed to respond to their fear, shifting and writhing in response to their emotions. Perhaps Acker's control was more fragile than they realized. But before they could form a plan, the room seemed to shift again. The walls rippled, distorting as though the paint itself was alive, and a new figure appeared in the corner of the room. It was a woman, her features indistinct, her face half hidden in shadow. She was reaching toward them, her hands stretching out as though to pull them into the canvas. The sight of her made Ellie's stomach churn, the fear creeping back in her chest. It was as though the very air was thickening, suffocating her with its presence. The woman's form flickered, shifting in and out of existence, as though she were trapped between worlds. Ellie recognized her now, the woman from the mural, the one who had been part of the original warning, the one who had been trapped inside Acker's painting for so long. "She's not real," Ellie said through clenched teeth. "None of this is real. We need to remember that." But as the words left her mouth, the woman's form grew clearer, her hands stretching farther, her fingers now brushing the edge of Ellie's own. The contact was cold, unnaturally so, sending a jolt of icy fear through her body. For a moment, she felt the woman's touch invade her mind, her thoughts becoming cloudy and disoriented. Ellie's vision blurred, and she could feel herself slipping, her grip on reality faltering. She struggled to focus, to fight back against the overwhelming sensation of being pulled into the woman's painted form. "Ellie!" Ben shouted, pulling her away from the figure. His grip was firm, but the sensation of being tethered to something larger, something darker, still lingered. "Stay with me. Stay with us. You can't let this thing take you." Ellie blinked rapidly, trying to shake off the feeling of her mind being pulled into the painting. The woman's face loomed in her mind, her expression twisted in agony, as though she too was a prisoner of Acker's nightmarish world. The horror was real, but so was their strength. They were still alive, still capable of resisting. "Focus," Rachel said, her voice unwavering. "We can beat him. We can break the hold he has on us." But even as she spoke, the walls began to shift again, and the paintings seemed to grow darker, their eyes widening, their mouths opening in silent screams. The air thickened, the room growing colder, and Acker's laughter echoed once again, loud and distorted. This time, it wasn't just a sound. It was a vibration in their bones, a presence that seemed to surround them, suffocating them with its weight. The painted world was closing in, but so were their chances. They had to act. They had to destroy the illusion before it consumed them completely. The room had grown even more oppressive, the walls now flickering like an old television screen, with colors bleeding into one another in waves that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The flickering light from the paintings cast distorted shadows across the floor, creating an eerie landscape where the line between reality and nightmare blurred further with each passing second. Acker's control over the space was tightening, his presence suffocating the air around them as if the very atmosphere had been transformed into his own creation. Ellie could feel the weight of the air pressing down on her chest, each breath feeling like a struggle against an unseen force. It was as though the room had grown sentient, aware of their every movement, reacting to their fear and panic. The temperature dropped noticeably, sending shivers down her spine, as if the walls themselves were exhaling a cold breath. The figures in the paintings, once static and unmoving, now shifted ever so slightly, their eyes following their every step. It was as though Acker had figured out a way to keep them trapped within this nightmare, ensuring that they could never escape. "Ben, Rachel, we need to stay calm," Ellie said, her voice barely a whisper, as though speaking too loudly might provoke the wrath of whatever had overtaken the room. She could feel the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end as the silence pressed in on them, thick and suffocating. "We need to figure out a way to break free from this. We can't let him win." Rachel, her eyes wide with fear, nodded, but her hands trembled slightly as she reached for Ellie's arm. "I don't understand. How is he doing this? How do we get here? And why does it feel like we're part of his creation now?" Ben, always the one with the most analytical mind, seemed to be deep in thought. "He's bending reality," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "This room, these paintings, they're all part of his twisted perception of the world. We're trapped inside it, but if we understand how he thinks, how he paints, maybe we can disrupt it. Maybe we can break the cycle." Ellie turned to him, her gaze intense. "But how? Everything feels so real. We can't just look at these paintings and hope for some kind of revelation. We need to understand what he's doing, how he's making us feel like this is all real." Ben's eyes widened, as though something had clicked in his mind. "That's it," he muttered under his breath. "We're not just in his paintings. We've become part of his process. It's not just that we're trapped inside his world. It's that we're part of his work, part of his creative vision. That's how he's controlling us." Ellie's mind raced. "You mean we're not just his prisoners? We're his brushstrokes? We're part of the canvas itself?" Rachel stepped forward, her voice rising in urgency. "So, how do we stop it? If we're part of his creation, how do we break out of it? How do we sever the connection?" Ben's eyes scanned the room, focusing on the swirling paintings that covered every surface. Each brushstroke, every color choice, every distorted figure seemed to be alive with a malevolent intent. The room itself seemed like a massive, living organism, pulsating with an energy that was dark and suffocating. We need to find the key, the central piece of his work, whatever it is that ties all of this together. We need to find the brushstroke that's anchoring us to this place. Ellie felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. Acker had woven them into his work so seamlessly that they had become inseparable from it. But if they were indeed part of his vision, it stood to reason that there was a focal point, a central piece that had given birth to everything else. The key to their escape, she realized, lay not in trying to fight Acker directly, but in unraveling the very foundation of his creation. But as the realization dawned on her, the room seemed to react. The walls rippled, the paintings stretching and twisting, as though the room itself was trying to push back against their thoughts. The flickering light became more erratic, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to move independently, as though they were alive. Ellie could feel the presence of Acker looming over them, watching, waiting. Then she saw it. A figure in one of the paintings, its eyes locked on her with an intensity that made her stomach churn. It was a woman, her features twisted in a grotesque distortion, but there was something familiar about her. As Ellie's gaze fixed on the woman, she realized with a shock that it was herself, trapped within Acker's creation. But unlike the other figures, this version of Ellie didn't look like a passive part of the scene. She was reaching out, her hand extended toward the others, as though trying to warn them. "Ellie!" Rachel gasped. "Look at that painting, what is that? Is that you?" Ellie's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped closer to the painting. The woman in the canvas seemed to be trying to communicate something, her mouth moving in silent pleas, her expression filled with desperation. As Ellie reached out, the room seemed to tighten around them, the air thickening, the paintings becoming more distorted. A whisper floated through the air, so faint it was almost imperceptible, but it was unmistakably Acker's voice. "You think you could break free? You're already mine? All of you?" Ellie recoiled, the weight of his words sinking deep into her bones. He had always been watching, always been a part of their every thought. The room, the paintings, everything in this nightmare was an extension of him. There was no escape without confronting the very essence of what he had created. "I won't let you break free." Acker's voice echoed louder now, a sound that seemed to come from every direction at once. "You are mine, and you will never leave." But Ellie, her mind sharp and her resolve hardening, knew one thing for certain: she would not give in. Acker's control, as suffocating as it was still based on his perception of reality. And if they could tear apart the very foundation of that perception, they could unravel everything. They could escape. The answer lay within the painting itself, and they would find it no matter what it took. As Ellie, Ben, and Rachel stood before the painting, their minds raced with an urgency that was impossible to ignore. The twisted version of Ellie in the canvas, her distorted features reaching out toward them, was no longer just a figment of Acker's macabre imagination. It had become the key, a key that could unlock the door to their escape. But how could they sever the bond that tied them to this nightmare? How could they disrupt the sinister artist's hold on them when even the very air they breathed felt like it was being controlled by his malevolent will? The pressure in the room had become unbearable, as if the walls themselves were closing in. The temperature had plummeted further, and the air seemed thick with something darker, heavier. The whisper of Acker's voice still lingered in the background, its presence like a cloud of smoke creeping into their minds, making it harder to think clearly. But Ellie's gaze remained fixed on the painting, the distorted version of herself, a trapped reflection. She understood now. Acker had made her a part of his vision, a permanent fixture in the disturbing world he had created. "We need to destroy it," Ben said suddenly, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "We need to destroy that painting." Ellie turned to him, her thoughts aligning with his in a way that felt almost instinctual. "But how?" she asked, her voice tight. "How do we destroy something that's keeping us here? It's not just a painting. It's part of the structure of this place." Rachel stepped forward, her face a mixture of determination and fear. Maybe we don't destroy it. Maybe we disrupt it. Her voice wavered, but there was something in her eyes, a spark of hope. We've seen how Acker manipulates the paintings, how he bends them to his will. What if we don't try to destroy it? What if we try to change it? Ben's eyes widened, as if a light bulb had gone off in his mind. What if we can paint over the distortion? What if we can use his own methods against him? Ellie's pulse quickened. It was a dangerous idea, risky, but it might be their only chance. If they could alter the painting, shift the narrative that Acker had woven, they might disrupt the very structure of his control. The question was, where would they even begin? How could they manipulate the painting without becoming even more entangled in Acker's vision? I don't know, Ellie admitted, her eyes fixed on the woman in the painting, the twisted version of herself that seemed so desperate. But we have to try. We can't just stand here and wait for him to take control of everything. Rachel nodded, and without another word, she took a step forward, her fingers brushing against the surface of the canvas. The moment her skin made contact with the painting, the world around them seemed to shift. The air grew heavier, and the room seemed to pulse with a deep, rhythmic thrum. Ellie could feel her heartbeat echoing in her chest, syncing with the eerie vibrations that reverberated through the room. It was as if the painting had responded to her touch, reacting in a way that was both unsettling and profound. A crack appeared in the canvas. At first, it was subtle, a thin, jagged line that ran from the bottom to the top of the painting. But then, it spread quickly, like the fracture of glass, and the room seemed to tremble. Ellie stepped forward, her breath catching in her throat as she realized that the crack was not just in the canvas. It was spreading throughout the entire room, unraveling the twisted structure that Acker had so carefully crafted. The walls, once firm and oppressive, now seemed to bend and warp as if the very fabric of the room was being torn apart. "What's happening?" Ben exclaimed, his voice trembling as he grasped Rachel's arm. "It's working," Ellie said, her voice barely above a whisper. She could feel it now, the subtle shift in the balance of power. The crack in the canvas was not just a crack. It was an opening, a fracture in Acker's control. If they could exploit this, they might be able to break free from the painting's grip entirely. But even as hope flickered in their hearts, the sinister presence of Acker loomed larger. The walls groaned, and the air became thick with his mocking laughter. "You think you can escape?" Acker's voice rang out, more forceful than before, filled with malice. "You think you can break free from my masterpiece?" Ellie's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the crack spread further, the room now vibrating with the intensity of it. "We're not trying to escape, Acker," she called out, her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to overtake her. "We're taking back control." The room seemed to shake in response, the temperature dropping even further as the lights flickered violently. The paintings around them, those once static, inanimate figures, began to move. Shadows twisted and writhed across the walls, their movements frenetic and erratic, as if they were alive and trying to break free from the confines of the canvas. Then, with a sickening lurch, the crack in the painting widened, and the image of Ellie, the distorted version of herself, began to change. The woman in the painting no longer seemed to be reaching out in desperation. Instead, her eyes hardened with defiance, and a fierce expression of determination replaced the look of helplessness. She was no longer just a victim of Acker's twisted vision. She was fighting back. "This is your work, Acker," Ellie shouted, her voice rising over the chaos that was now consuming the room. "And we're going to finish it." The crack in the canvas continued to grow, and as it did, the room seemed to tear at the seams. The walls, once solid, now looked like they were being peeled back, revealing something dark and infinite beneath. It was as though Acker's entire creation was beginning to unravel, and with it, his power began to fade. But the battle was far from over. Acker's presence, though weakened, was still there, lurking in the shadows, watching with malevolent eyes. And as Ellie reached for the crack in the canvas, ready to tear it wide open, she knew this was just the beginning. Acker would not let them escape so easily. But for the first time since they entered the nightmare, Ellie felt a glimmer of hope. They weren't trapped anymore. They had found a way to fight back. and they were going to win. The moment the canvas began to fracture, the tension that had gripped Ellie, Ben, and Rachel began to crack as well. It was as if the world around them had shifted from a nightmare into something far more chaotic and unpredictable. The walls that once stood firm, containing them within their twisted reality, now appeared to bend and warp, losing their integrity. The air, once thick with dread, had become electrified, vibrating with an almost tangible sense of something coming undone. And yet, amid the growing chaos, Ellie felt an unsettling calm settle over her, as though the unsettling nature of the room had shifted in their favor. Ben stood beside her, his expression pale, his hand clutched tightly around a nearby easel, as though it might provide some form of comfort or stability in the storm around them. Rachel, her face set in determination, had turned her attention to the larger crack in the canvas, now rippling like the surface of a disturbed pond. Her gaze never wavered as the room seemed to spin and lurch, its foundation shaking beneath their feet. "We've done something," Ellie whispered, almost to herself, trying to make sense of what was happening. "We've changed it," Rachel answered, her voice sharp, though her eyes were filled with a combination of hope and unease. The crack in the painting was widening, as though it could no longer contain the forces inside it, forces that Ellie and her friends had begun to tap into, perhaps unwittingly. But Acker's presence was still there, more palpable now than ever. His voice, once mocking, now reverberated through the room like an echo that refused to fade. "You think this will stop me? This is just the beginning. You are nothing more than ants crawling on the surface of my creation." Ellie's heart skipped a beat at the sound of his voice, a chilling reminder that they were still far from free. His malevolent influence still lingered, even as the fabric of his world unraveled around them. She could feel his eyes on them, watching from the dark corners of the room, from the depths of the paintings that had once held nothing but stillness. Now, those paintings were alive, twisting and writhing as though trying to escape their frames, yearning to tear free from the confines Acker had created. But the crack in the painting continued to grow. The woman in the distorted version of Ellie now stood at the edge of the canvas, her eyes filled with an eerie sense of recognition, as if she knew what was about to happen. The once trapped figure seemed to be reaching out, her arms stretched wide, as if trying to pull herself into the real world. The painted face that had once been an abomination now held an air of something almost human. A sense of agency, of self-determination, replaced the helpless expression she had worn before. "We can't stop now," Ben said suddenly, his voice steady but urgent. "We need to finish what we started." Ellie nodded. It was as though the painting had drawn them into its narrative, into its twisted and terrifying world. But now they were rewriting the story. If they could bring the woman in the painting to life, if they could allow her to escape the confines of Acker's control, they might have a chance at severing his grip on them entirely. They were no longer pawns in his dark masterpiece. They had become the architects of their own escape. "Do it," Ellie urged Rachel, her voice filled with a sense of urgency she had never felt before. "If we don't push through now, we'll lose our chance." Rachel stepped forward once more, her eyes locked on the painting. She reached for the crack, her fingers trembling slightly as they brushed against the edge of the canvas. The moment her skin touched it, a surge of energy crackled through the room, jolting them all to attention. The air hummed with electricity as the walls seemed to vibrate in response to her touch. The woman in the painting moved again, her limbs shifting, her features twitching as if she were coming to life before their eyes. "Keep going," Ellie said, her voice hoarse with the strain of what was happening. "We need to help her break free." As Rachel's hand pressed more firmly against the crack, the room seemed to twist around them, the paintings now completely coming to life, their subjects writhing in agony, as if they were fighting against the brushstrokes that had once held them. Their eyes, once hollow, now glimmered with a terrifying awareness. The painted figures trapped in their frames howled silently as they reached out, their movements slow and agonized, their forms warped and deformed by the very forces they had once been subjected to. Ellie felt a sudden surge of dread, her heart racing in her chest. She had been so focused on the painting, on the possibility of escape, that she had failed to recognize the magnitude of the consequences. By attempting to tear open the painting's world, by manipulating the very fabric of Acker's creation, they had unleashed something far darker and more dangerous than they had anticipated. A voice broke through the chaos, Acker's voice. It wasn't mocking anymore, but filled with an ominous rage. "You fools," he spat. "You have no idea what you've done. You think you can destroy what I've built? You've only made it stronger. You've become part of my vision, and you will never leave." The crack in the painting widened, and for a moment, everything stood still. The room, the walls, the air, everything seemed to pause in that instant, as if holding its breath. Ellie could see it now. The woman in the painting, her features no longer distorted, but full of clarity, of purpose. She was no longer trapped within the confines of the canvas. She had stepped beyond it, emerging into the real world as the painting's frame crumbled away. And then it hit them all at once. The room exploded with an overwhelming, nauseating force. The floor cracked beneath them, and the painting shattered, their once still figures crashing to the ground like broken statues. The paintings were no longer just images. They were memories, experiences, moments of anguish and joy, and the boundaries between them and the real world had become impossibly thin. The distinction between what was real and what was a creation became impossible to discern. Ben staggered back, his face pale, as the world around them began to collapse into itself, and Ellie felt the walls of the room closing in. "Get ready," Rachel said, her voice barely audible over the crashing chaos. "This is just the beginning." In the aftermath of the explosion, everything Ellie and her friends had known about the world, about their reality, had shifted beyond recognition. The room was no longer a familiar space. The walls had twisted and melted into grotesque forms, the edges of the paintings now sprawling across the floor like strange, bleeding tendrils reaching for the corners of the room. Each canvas seemed to pulsate, as if they were alive, each figure within them now making eye contact with the survivors. The once static artwork had come alive in the most horrific and unsettling way. The room, once a place of art and creation, had become a house of horrors, a realm that was as much a product of Acker's twisted mind as it was an extension of their own fears. Ellie looked around at the devastation, her chest tightening with each passing moment. Her mind was reeling from what had just transpired: the shattering of the painting, the woman's escape, the forceful collapse of the room. But there was one thought that circled relentlessly through her mind, a question that gnawed at her. What had they actually done? In their quest to escape, they had unleashed something far worse than Acker, something even more uncontrollable. The walls of the room seemed to distort and warp further, as if mocking them for thinking they could control the forces at play. Ben and Rachel were equally shaken, their faces drawn with fear and disbelief. Ben's hands still gripped the easel, though his knuckles were pale from the tension. Rachel, on the other hand, stood still, staring at the woman who had now emerged from the painting. She was no longer confined to the canvas, but had stepped fully into the room, her features clearer than ever, though they held a strange, unfamiliar quality. Her eyes glimmered with recognition, but there was something hollow in them as well. Something unspoken, like a message that Ellie could not decipher. "You did it." The woman's voice was barely a whisper, but it echoed through the room with an unsettling weight. "You freed me, but you've doomed yourselves." Ellie shivered at the words, feeling a chill run down her spine. The woman's tone wasn't one of gratitude or relief, but rather a warning, a premonition of what was to come. She had thought that helping the woman escape the confines of the painting would be their salvation, their ticket out of Acker's hellish creation. But now, standing in front of them, the woman seemed almost like a ghost, bound to a fate they couldn't possibly understand. Rachel, the ever-determined one, stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. "What do you mean, doomed? We got you out. We freed you." The woman shook her head slowly, her expression unreadable. "You cannot escape what you've awakened. This place is not just a room. It's a door to other worlds, other paintings, Acker doesn't just paint with colors. He paints with reality itself. He never truly left the canvas. And now, neither can you. Ellie's breath caught in her throat as the gravity of the woman's words settled over her like a suffocating weight. Acker had created more than just a room full of haunted paintings. He had crafted entire dimensions within the artwork, pulling them into a space where the boundaries of reality and fiction were not just blurred, but eradicated entirely. Ellie had known something was off from the beginning. The strange sensation that the paintings were not just images, but living entities. But hearing the woman confirm, it left her reeling. "What do we do?" Ben asked, his voice cracking with desperation. "We can't stay here. We have to get out." The woman looked at him with an expression that was almost pitying. "There is no escape. Not now. Not from Acker's grasp. You're part of the painting now. You're in his world. And once you're in, you can never leave." Rachel clenched her fists, frustration and anger painting her face. "No, we're not giving up. We're not going to stay trapped in this nightmare." The woman's face darkened as if the words themselves had summoned a presence that was lurking just beneath the surface of the room. The air grew colder, and the walls seemed to pulse with a strange, unnatural rhythm, as if they were breathing, as though the room was aware of their presence. It was no longer just the paintings that had come to life. The very space itself was shifting, molding itself into something new, something far more sinister. "Don't you understand?" the woman whispered. "You can't change the rules. You've already made the mistake of believing you can control this world. But once you've crossed over into Acker's realm, you become part of it. You are his creation now." Ellie felt the weight of her words like a shackle around her ankles, pulling her down into despair. She had thought they were making progress, that they were nearing an end, a resolution. But now it seemed that Acker's hold over them was far more powerful than they had ever imagined. They were not just fighting to escape. They were fighting to stay human, to remain real in a world that was bending, twisting, and reshaping around them. Suddenly, the room seemed to lurch, and Ellie felt the ground beneath her feet tremble. The walls, once stationary, began to crack and crumble, as though the entire space was beginning to collapse in on itself. The air was thick with the sound of tearing paper, the screech of paint being scraped away, and the faint whisper of something far darker and older than anything they could comprehend. "We need to go," Rachel said, her voice tight with urgency. "We can't stay here. This place is falling apart." Ben nodded, his expression grim, but there was no direction to follow. There were no doors, no windows, no clear way out. It was as if the room itself had swallowed all of their options, leaving them with nothing but the horrifying realization that they were trapped in the very space they had tried to escape. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the paintings around them seemed to leer, their eyes following their every move as if they were waiting for something. A final act, a final moment before the collapse was complete. Ellie's heart pounded in her chest as she realized that they were not just fighting for their lives anymore. They were fighting for their very existence. If they failed to escape Acker's realm, they would cease to be. The world outside would forget them, and they would become part of the endless nightmare that Acker had created. There was no more running, no more hiding. "We have to finish what we started," Ellie said, the words coming out more firmly than she felt. "We have to find a way to destroy it. Destroy him, before this world consumes us all." But as she said it, she realized how empty the words felt. How could they possibly destroy something so immense, so powerful, when the very nature of the place had become so malleable, so unpredictable? Could they even win? Or were they already lost, trapped within a nightmare that would never end? As Ellie and her companions moved deeper into the distorted space of Acker's twisted world, the gravity of their situation seemed to shift with every step. The room, once a sanctuary for the creation of art, now felt like a living nightmare, its walls breathing and pulsating with a malevolent rhythm. Their surroundings were no longer recognizable. They had been swallowed whole by the very paintings they had once admired. The paintings, which had once been mere reflections of reality, had transcended their purpose, becoming gateways to other dimensions, other horrors. Ellie's mind reeled with the implications of the woman's cryptic warning. They were part of Acker's creation now. Their existence, their reality, had become one with the artwork, no longer separate from the madness of the painter's mind. The weight of this realization pressed on her chest, a constant reminder that there was no going back. The only question left was whether they could fight the pull of this alternate reality or if they were doomed to be consumed by it. Rachel, ever the optimist despite the overwhelming odds, remained determined. "We can't just give up," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the eerie silence of the collapsing room. "We've come this far. There has to be a way out. We have to find a way to defeat Acker." Ellie nodded, though a part of her wondered if Rachel's words were merely a coping mechanism. The thought of returning to the world they had left behind, back to the safety of a life that made sense, seemed increasingly futile. How could they possibly defeat something that defied all the rules of reality, something that could alter the very fabric of existence with a stroke of a brush? Ben's grip tightened on the easel, his knuckles white, as if clinging to a final shred of normalcy in a world that was rapidly becoming anything but. "We need to destroy the paintings. They're the key, aren't they? Acker's power is in them." The woman, who had once been a part of the art herself, looked on silently, her features unreadable. She had become a ghost in this place, a spectator to their futile struggle. She knew that the paintings were the source of Acker's influence, but even she seemed unsure how to destroy them. How could one defeat a force that was both intangible and omnipresent? Ellie turned her eyes toward the nearest painting, a canvas that had once depicted a serene landscape. Now, it was warped, its features twisted into grotesque forms that made the scenery seem alive with terror. The trees appeared to stretch toward them, their branches like skeletal arms, and the sky above had turned an unnatural shade of green, swirling with ominous clouds. The colors on the canvas seemed to shimmer, as if they were fluid, constantly changing, slipping through their fingers. It was a living thing, alive in a way that defied all logic. The woman's voice, now tinged with resignation, broke through their thoughts. "You cannot destroy the paintings by force. They are not just images. They are the very fabric of Acker's mind. To destroy them would be to destroy him, and in doing so, you would destroy yourselves as well. This world and its creator are bound together. The paintings cannot be separated from the man who created them." Ellie's heart sank at the weight of this new revelation. Destroying Acker meant annihilating everything, including themselves. But were they truly so bound to his world that they couldn't escape its pull? Was there no way to break free from his control without sacrificing everything? Suddenly, a sharp noise rang out in the distance, like a deep, guttural growl. It was a sound that seemed to resonate through the very walls, shaking the foundations of the room. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and Ellie's stomach lurched with a sense of dread. Whatever had caused the sound was growing closer, and there was no way to escape it. The very fabric of Acker's world was beginning to crumble, and with it, the boundaries between reality and nightmare were disintegrating. "We're running out of time," Rachel said, her voice tight with panic. "We have to do something. If we don't stop him now, we'll all be trapped here forever." Ellie knew she was right. The world they had once known was slipping further and further away, replaced by the madness of Acker's creation. But what could they do? How could they fight a force so vast, so entwined with the very nature of their existence? That's when it hit her, something subtle, yet undeniable. In the distance, barely visible through the shifting walls, was another painting, a new one that they hadn't seen before. Unlike the others, it didn't seem to warp or bend. Its colors were muted, its figures more still. Ellie couldn't explain why, but something about it felt different. It was as if the painting was calling to her, beckoning her forward. "Look," Ellie said, her voice trembling with newfound hope. "That painting, it's not like the others." Ben and Rachel turned to follow her gaze. The woman, too, seemed to register its significance, her eyes narrowing with suspicion, though she didn't speak. There was a hesitation in the air, a moment of stillness before Ellie's feet moved of their own accord. She didn't know why, but she felt drawn to it. compelled by something beyond her understanding. This painting felt like the answer, the key to everything. As they moved toward it, the room seemed to grow colder, the oppressive atmosphere thickening. The walls closed in, the paintings around them shifting, their faces contorting in agony. But Ellie, her mind set on the strange new painting, pushed forward. When they reached it, the air was thick with tension. Ellie stood before the painting, her heart pounding in her chest. It was a simple image, a man standing alone in the center of the canvas, staring directly at her. His eyes were impossibly dark, filled with an abyssal void that seemed to pull her in. His face was familiar, though she couldn't place where she had seen it before. His features were both human and monstrous, as if the painting itself was undecided about what he should be. And then it hit her. The man in the painting wasn't just Acker. It was them, Ellie, Ben, Rachel. They were the final image. They had been part of Acker's creation all along, woven into the very fabric of his mind. This painting was the end of their story, the end of their fight. The realization was chilling. If they destroyed this painting, they would destroy themselves. If they allowed it to remain, they would forever be trapped in this world, bound to Acker's dark vision. The choice was now theirs. As the realization of their fate settled in, Ellie felt the weight of every choice she had made lead up to this moment. The last painting, the one that seemed to echo their own presence, their own essence, stood before them like a final testament to their struggles. The man depicted in the canvas wasn't just a part of Acker's creation, but a reflection of them. The twisted irony was not lost on Ellie. Their existence had become so entangled with Acker's madness that they were no longer separate from it. It was as if the story they had been living, every painful, surreal twist, had been nothing more than a brushstroke in a larger, more horrifying painting. As Ellie stood there, her eyes locked onto the man in the canvas, the others seemed frozen in place as well, caught in the same realization. Rachel's face was pale, her eyes wide with disbelief, while Ben, ever the skeptic, now seemed resigned to the madness surrounding them. The woman who had once been part of Acker's artistic world had fallen silent, her features unreadable, as though she too had long ago accepted that there were no answers, only endless cycles of torment. "Is this it then?" Rachel finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as though the very air might shatter if she spoke too loudly. "This is the end?" Ellie couldn't bring herself to answer. She knew that there were no more words that could explain this moment. No comforting platitudes that could undo the damage that had already been done. The final brushstroke, the one that would either set them free or bind them to Acker's vision forever, loomed before them. And yet, despite the terror that gripped her heart, Ellie understood that this moment wasn't just about survival. It was about choice. Acker had always believed in his creations, in the control they represented. But this was their world now. They had the power to decide how it would end. The woman who had been with them for so long stepped forward slowly, her movements deliberate, as if she too had come to terms with the inevitability of their fate. She reached out to touch the painting, her fingers grazing the surface of the canvas. The moment her skin made contact, the air around them seemed to pulse, vibrating with an unnatural energy. The colors on the canvas shimmered, swirling in a hypnotic dance, as if reacting to her touch. A part of Ellie wanted to shout out, to stop her, but she remained frozen, paralyzed by the scene unfolding before her. In the flicker of that instant, the room around them seemed to collapse and expand at once, the walls bending inward and then outward like the breath of a living creature. The paintings on the walls began to distort violently, their forms stretching and snapping, their faces contorting into grotesque, inhuman shapes. Ellie's stomach turned as she realized that every figure, every brushstroke, had been a part of Acker's deranged vision, each one a part of his tortured psyche, each one bound to this place like a prisoner to its creator. "What do we do?" Ben's voice trembled as he turned to Ellie, his eyes searching for answers in the chaos that surrounded them. But there was nothing she could say. Words were meaningless in this moment. The world they had once known was slipping away, replaced by a nightmare they could neither understand nor escape. The boundaries between reality and art had dissolved, and now there was no telling where one began and the other ended. Ellie's gaze drifted back to the painting. She thought of the woman's warning, that to destroy the painting was to destroy themselves. Yet in that moment, Ellie realized the truth of the words she had heard long ago. Acker's power had never been in the art itself. It had always been in the creator. Acker's madness, his obsession, had infected them all, not just through the images on the walls, but through their very being. They had become the story, trapped within the cycle of creation and destruction that had no clear end. I think we have to let it go, Ellie said, her voice steady, though her heart was pounding. She turned to look at Ben and Rachel, their faces drawn and pale. We can't keep fighting it. This world, it's not ours anymore. It never was. For a long moment, no one spoke. The room was thick with tension, the air heavy with the unspoken weight of the decision they had to make. But then, as if by silent agreement, the group moved forward together, their eyes fixed on the painting before them. It was time to face the inevitable. With a deep breath, Ellie reached out and touched the canvas. The moment her fingers made contact, the world seemed to pause. The swirling colors of the painting began to distort, rippling outwards as though the fabric of reality itself was being torn apart. Ellie felt a sharp, almost physical tug, as if the painting was trying to pull her back into its world, to swallow her whole. But she held firm, determined to finish what they had started. And then, with a final, resounding crack, the painting began to disintegrate. The colors bled from the canvas, dripping like ink from a shattered dream. The image of the man, of them, faded into nothingness, leaving only blank space where the painting had once been. For a long moment, there was nothing. No sound, no movement, just the eerie stillness that filled the void left behind by Acker's influence. The world seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something, waiting for an end or perhaps a beginning. Ellie exhaled slowly, her heart still racing. But as the silence stretched on, she felt the weight in her chest begin to lift. They had done it. They had broken free. Around her, the walls of the room began to crack and disintegrate, the paintings falling away into dust, leaving nothing but the remnants of a world that had never truly existed. The air shifted, becoming lighter, as though the very atmosphere had been cleansed. A new reality was unfolding before them, a reality not shaped by Acker's twisted vision, but by their own will. And as they stood there, together in the quiet aftermath, Ellie realized that their story wasn't over. It had been rewritten, torn apart, and rebuilt, just as the world around them had been. They were no longer prisoners of Acker's art, no longer part of his dark masterpiece. They were free. For the first time in a long while, Ellie felt hope stir within her, a quiet, powerful hope that whispered of new beginnings and untold possibilities. And as the last remnants of Acker's world faded away, she knew that this was only the beginning of their real story.